In this panel, we're going to discuss the technical side of energy storage. Brad did a great job introducing different technologies in the energy storage space earlier this morning, but we've got a great panel assembled here. I also wanted to do a quick plug. There's a very nice calendar outside from the Electricity Storage Association, and it's actually profiles a bunch of different applications for energy storage on the grid. So if you're interested in the technical side of it, it's just a nice way to see some of the applications that are out there. Our goal for this panel is to run through different applications that we're going to see on the grid, where the technologies are at, where are opportunities for innovation, and how Silicon Valley can get involved to help realize the energy storage on the grid. So first, I'd like to just ask our panelists to introduce themselves.
Tom Stepien. I'm the COO of Primus Power. Primus is a venture-backed startup. We are a flow battery company. We are one of the recipients of some DOE funding.
So I'm David McMillan, president of Megawatt Storage Farms. Megawatt is an independent developer, operator, and owner of storage facilities. So one way to think of us is we're like a wind or solar farm developer, except we're doing it with storage rather than wind turbines and solar panels.
Dan Rassler with the Electric Power Research Institute. We're up the street here in Palo Alto. We're a non-for-profit consortium that manages a broad portfolio of energy and clean energy solutions for the electric power industry. I'm the program manager of the energy storage program at EPRI.
And my name is Kelsey Lynn. I'm using a high-tech invisible name tag today, so hopefully you can remember that. I work at Fire Lake Capital. We are a early-stage, technology-oriented clean tech venture fund, and we've actually made 3 investments in the energy storage space. One in ultracapacitors, one in lithium supply. It was touched on in the last panel that lithium supply may be a challenge if we see lithium-ion batteries scale the way they're expected to, and so we've invested in a technology that can create it domestically at a global low cost. And then we have a lithium metal primary battery investment as well. So one of the things I want to start on first is the energy storage has started receiving so much more attention in the last few years, and I think that's evident to people who have been going to these events. And all of a sudden, the venture capital industry is very involved in it. More people from the technology industry are shifting over. And Tom, I believe you're fairly new to the energy storage sector. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why now.
Why now? Good question. You know, we heard some of that this morning. You know, for me, it boils down to 3 things. It's cost, it's renewables, and it's smart grid. On the cost side, if you look at utilities, it's just an enormous challenge they have, and Hal can probably talk about this a lot better than I can. They have billions of dollars of assets. They have to size themselves for the worst case condition, and if you actually write the hottest, muggiest day in August. And if you look at those assets, it turns out that something like 10% of the generation assets and 25% of the distribution assets are only used for 5% of the year. So for the other 8,360 hours of the year, those expensive assets sit idle. So storage can help improve that whole cost equation. On the renewables, Janice talked about the 33% RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, for California. There's 27, I think, of the 50 states in the U.S. that have RPSs in place. You're going to meet those RPSs with wind and solar. Wind is very intermittent. It's like my teenagers when I come home. You never know what mood they're going to be in, right? The wind could be blowing, it could be quiet. So it's very intermittent. You need a storage system somewhere in the loop. And on the smart grid, if you really had the opportunity to look at the grid and start with a clean sheet of paper, you certainly would make a number of changes, and probably one of the most important ones is to put a capacitive element somewhere in the system. There's very little capacitive element, very little storage in the system today, and it's because it's too expensive. So Companies like the one I'm in, and there's several other startups in the valley here, are all focused on trying to change that cost equation, because to have a truly smart grid, you need storage.
Thanks. And David, I know you're out there installing projects with energy storage on the grid. Where do you see the early adopters for energy storage technology on the grid?
So if you look at the grid, let me step back just a bit. There's kind of two categories of applications. One is the one that we touched on at the end of the last panel, which is transmission and distribution deferral. And a key barrier at the moment there is, at the moment, FERC doesn't allow storage to go into the transmission rate base. Megawatt and others are party to an action right now, which is trying to get that fixed. The other place in the grid is to manage the volatility of the grid, and that's always been an issue from the demand side, because you don't have to call the utility before you turn on a big motor. They just have to manage the grid to be able to handle that. But with the growth of renewables, that introduces now volatility from the generation side. Now, if you look at that volatility, you can divide it from short-term volatility that's fluctuating second by second, all the way through long-term volatility. In California, for example, we have way too much wind in the middle of the night. It typically drives the prices negative. Where we'd really like that energy is during the day. Now, when you look at the applications, the so-called ancillary services that people have been talking about are generally focused on the shorter-term applications, seconds and minutes. And there's actually priced markets for those, and those are the places where energy storage is initially going to be deployed. Alternano and A123 both have demos outside of the conference room where they're talking about the use of their facilities in the grid to do frequency regulation. Beacon is doing the same thing with flywheels. So those are existing markets that you can use today to monetize storage, and in some cases the economics look fairly reasonable, particularly if you take into account the tax credits that are coming. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the ability to shift energy from night to day. As Alok mentioned, if you look at that, generally speaking, that alone will not allow you to monetize the storage. The price swings are just not big enough. Now, in between those two extremes, you've got the issue of managing the grid for minutes and hours. And it turns out now that California ISO, in looking at the issue of getting to 33% renewables by 2020, they see situations where the wind and the solar is ramping so fast that using available fossil resources, they don't have the ramp rate to be able to handle it. And so they see storage as critical in plugging that gap, because storage can swing instantly from full charge to full discharge, whereas fossil fuel plants have limited ramp rates. So this issue of ramping at the minutes and the hours is going to become an increasingly important issue. The problem is there are no markets that you can effectively monetize that in today. So part of the trick, I think, is getting the regulatory agencies aligned so we can get streamlined processes. Megawatt has been a key driver of the idea of setting a mandate for 5% storage requirement, just as there's an RPS standard for renewables, 5% RPS standard for storage in order to have the storage on the grid that we need in 2020. We estimate we need 4 gigawatts of clean, deep storage to handle this minute-to-hour ramp issue to get to the 33% renewables. If we don't start deploying storage at 400 megawatts per year pretty quick, we're not going to hit that. We're going to end up saddled as ratepayers with much less efficient solutions and much less reliable grid. So, in summary, the short-term second-by-second markets, those are markets that can be addressed today. The very long-term markets, currently there is not an economic market that can justify the storage alone for that. There's tremendous opportunity of the minutes to hours, but we're going to have to get a mandate or streamlined regulatory process in place to make that happen to meet the 33% RPS goal.
Quick follow-up question on that. Brad mentioned in his presentation that we're going to see electricity prices rise, and I totally agree with that, particularly for peak. So do you think there's a particular, how much do you think peak prices have to rise before load shifting is economic?
Unfortunately, there's not a simple answer to that. It's a very complex analysis. The reason for that is you have to look at how often is the storage being cycled. In California, for example, right now, it's not unusual in the middle of the night to actually see negative prices where you would be paid to store the storage. So you have to have an estimate of what the negative prices are. It's just not a simple answer to that, unfortunately.
Okay. Dan, could you talk a little bit about how the rollout of renewables is impacting the applications and what are new emerging applications that we'll be seeing?
Okay, sure. And I totally agree with Tom's points on the drivers, but wind integration is a huge driver, and of course the electric sector emits about 30% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. So the industry, the utility industry, is really aligned around let's bring on more renewables. How can we do it and keep our country running on 24/7? So storage and wind integration is a huge issue. But I have to tell you, it's not. We really don't know the solution, the optimal solution set yet. Even in California, we really don't know how much storage we're really going to need for balancing. And I'm talking about more of an optimal societal. What's the optimal societal cost that we could use for storage? So we're in the process. We just did some work in ERCOT last year to understand how bulk storage fits into ERCOT, where 15 gigawatts of wind is going to be coming in 2015. And we'd like to do those similar market simulations in other regions. I understand Cal ISO just did some work with KEMA, so I'm anxiously waiting to see that report. It kind of rolls out what's the storage blueprint in California. We really don't have a storage blueprint in the wholesale level for wind in the United States, and that's something we're working on. The next renewable that's coming online is solar. Okay, and then you've got issues with the ramping again, so the cloud effects, both bulk solar, I'm talking primarily photovoltaic, and also distributed photovoltaic. So those are more emerging challenges. They're not pain points yet, but they could be pain points, particularly as you have a lot of distributed solar. There's a lot of work trying to understand how much distributed solar can you actually put in the distribution network.
Yeah. So for solar and wind, what do you consider competitive technologies to energy storage? Is it mostly, bigger transmission lines, natural gas?
Well, the grid still has a lot of inherent capability right now in balancing, doing all the balancing that Brad spoke about. It may not be exactly the best way to do it from a cost or a CO2 footprint, but fossil units are being used. Gas turbines are being used to firm wind. General Electric, last week, Rolls-Royce with some of their large, these are like 50 megawatt aeroderivative turbines that burn natural gas fuel, but they could be used to balance wind. That's the options, I think, in the wholesale area. And I agree in the distributed area, the pain point is managing the peak. And what utilities generally do is they adopt programs, they do capital investment, traditional wire solutions. So there's where storage can play a role, is to help in that CapEx deferral. Brad showed the transportable storage system. That's getting some interest, where you can move a storage system from area to area, perhaps in every 3 or 4 years, to monetize that CapEx deferral. I think also some recent work that we just did last year, and we do have a primer out right now that's sort of on draft form that I'd be happy to send out. But the real challenge is really monetizing, as we heard, monetizing multiple benefit streams. The CapEx deferral, peak shaving, even bringing in regulation services at a distribution level could be a way to really help the business case.
So just one follow-up on that, in particular the issue of using fossil fuel plants to balance out wind and solar. There's a good study which we actually reference on the Megawatt website, megawattsf.com, like megawattsstoragefarms.com. It's a study by Carnegie Mellon University, and they looked at some of these aero-derived fossil generators to try to estimate the emissions that they put out when they're cycling up and down in order to compensate for the volatility of wind and solar. And the conclusion is, in some cases, it can be as bad as the emissions are 240% of the emissions that are saved by having the wind and solar in the grid. In other words, you're moving backwards if you use those kinds of generators to smooth out the wind and solar. You'd be better off getting rid of the wind and solar and just running the generators at their optimal set point for best emissions and run them flat at that rate. So storage is, I think, key when you step back. Hal's advocating, let's have a single mandate for clean emissions rather than individual mandates for renewables and storage and so forth. Fine, but if you're going to do that, you have to step back and do the full accounting of what's happening with the greenhouse gases and look at what happens when you deploy the wind without storage and use the fossil fuel plants to try to balance it out. You're moving backwards. So the other issue I wanted to bring up is the optionality value of storage, particularly battery storage or flywheel storage. The beauty of this is it's very fast to deploy. You can deploy it in 6 months. You can deploy it exactly where you want on the grid. You don't need an air emissions permit because it has no emissions. You don't need water permits because it uses no water. It's quiet. You can put it close to the load when that makes sense, or close to the wind farms when that makes sense. You can deploy it exactly when you need it, exactly the number of megawatts you need, and exactly where on the grid you need it. So that's tremendous optionality. When you look at some of the other solutions people are talking about, they're saying, let's take 10 or 15 years to build a new pumped hydro facility. Let's take 10 years to build a new CASE facility. Let's take 10 years to put down new transmission lines. You don't have optionality with that. As Dan just mentioned, we may have a shift from wind towards solar. What's going to happen if you lay down the transmission lines to put wind farms in the middle of Mojave Desert, where now there's questions about can you get Bureau of Land Management permission to install there given protected species issues? What happens if the model ends up being distributed solar on Costco's? Well, if you've got storage, it gives you the optionality to adjust in 3 and 6 month intervals to the gradual growth of the grid towards a renewable grid. And in many cases, it's transportable, so even if you make a mistake, you can move it. That optionality is worth gold when you see the grid undergoing such a dramatic transition from a fossil fuel-based grid to a renewable grid. I'm not sure that's been fully accounted for in some of the analysis of storage.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective. I think most of these energy storage benefits are realized by the utility, but one of my concerns is that utilities are understandably incented to be reliable, but not necessarily incented to be testing new technologies, new and innovative technologies. And Tom, I'm hoping you can comment as, you know, the developer of a new technology that I imagine will be selling to utilities. How do you assess that risk?
Good question, because you're right, utilities are not exactly early adopters of some of this stuff. I think they're certainly playing, and Hal talked about, and other utilities have shown leadership. AES, AEP are looking at using lithium-ion trailers and things. I think there's something like in the U.S., 2,500 utilities, right? There's all the big ones that we know, but there's a whole bunch of smaller ones, right? Alameda has small one, Palo Alto has their own, Santa Clara, I think, has their own. So we think, and some people think, that the smaller municipals might be earlier adopters or maybe a little bit more experimental than the larger utilities. But again, it all breaks down to cost. And just to tie in with David's excellent point, I think the killer app here is something that has that optionality, the ability and the mobility that, that David and others have spoken of, at the cost of those large centralized cases, right? The pumped hydro is something like, round numbers, $200 per kilowatt hour. So if you can get that cost with the mobility, I think that's going to be the killer app. And then the market can help pull things along. And then utilities who may not be early adopters will see, oh my gosh, we got to jump on that and get pulled along with it.
Drawing on that for any of the three of you, do you think it's going to be easier to get utilities to adopt energy storage and scale it up, or to put it on the other side of the meter and get in demand management type applications?
So we're obviously a big believer in independent storage service providers, yep. And we look at the development when the grid was deregulated let me back up. When the grid was deregulated, you had vertically integrated utilities, and they were broken into 3 pieces: generation, transmission and distribution, and the load-serving entity, which is a group that buys wholesale power and deals with the end customers. And under deregulation, the purchase of energy had to be thrown open to open competition. And that led to the emergence of independent power producers like AES and Calpine. Those are tremendously successful businesses. Later on, when renewables came up, we saw the emergence of independent wind and solar farm developers. And the bulk of the early renewables was installed by those independents, not by the utilities. More recently, we saw the emergence of independent demand response companies like Enernoc and Converge, which had tremendous IPOs a couple of years ago. And again, that was because they were innovative, they were willing to move quickly, take advantage of these new technologies and communications capabilities, willing to move much faster than the utilities. We see the same thing now in storage. We think it's the next step. It'll be the independents that grab hold of this technology, move it out onto the grid, find innovative ways to deploy it, innovative ways to create new business models around that, will grow to large businesses, and then we see the utilities following along behind, moving slower, but potentially also being major forces in the industry just as they are in generation, now in renewables, and now starting to be in demand response.
I'd like to add to that. I think there's opportunities for many different business models. Unfortunately, right now, with the cost structure of storage, I think the utility adoption, particularly for peak shaving, what I call grid support, applications within the distribution area, where the utility can monetize the infrastructure assets and go to their commission with a business case. I think that is an early market for some technologies. And we're working with a framework for how the industry can present a business case to their commission using things like the total resource cost effectiveness test and life cycle cost analysis. I'd also comment that, and Brad talked about the convergence or the transportation sector driving electric vehicles, and also the need for the utility industry to need storage. And we see a huge opportunity for looking for stationary market applications that would use the PHEV type platform as a storage device in the stationary application. And that could be both on the utility side, or it could be on the customer side, or it could be a third party. Our prior research has shown that it's really difficult for the end user to pencil out the business case. I think you heard about that in the last panel. The time of use rate spread aren't significant enough, and the payback is too short. It's too long for most end users. So there could be opportunities for new business models where maybe it's an ESCO model where shared savings. But again, the facts around storage are they're still expensive, and the technical risk of many of these devices are not well understood yet. And that really pencils out. You need to understand the life cycle costs, the safety, and to pencil out a 15-year project, you have to be pretty sure about the technology to do a customer side deal.
Yeah. And speaking of the different technologies, Brad did a nice job of laying them out in his presentation. And Dan, I know you've spent a long time studying really all the different technologies in the energy storage space. I was hoping first you could comment on if you think there's anything he missed, or points that you'd like to make about the existing technologies. And then as an R&D director, what do you see coming down the pipeline that excites you?
Well, yeah, Brad didn't have a chance to talk about everything in the pipeline, but there is a lot of exciting stuff going on right now. There's just the stimulus funding that's going to deploy a lot of the current technologies in really good applications and really help us understand the costs and benefits and the risk, the technical risk and robustness of those. But in the emerging area, and it's really exciting to live here and to see the enthusiasm of our venture community in this space. There's emerging storage technologies that range from super ultra caps that sort of look like a lithium-ion battery, but they're cheaper and can have long energy duration. There's a suite of flow batteries. Primus is one. Several flow battery systems got funded last year, and these all offer the potential for much lower cost. Our market analysis shows that you've really got to be maybe well under, ideally under $400 a kilowatt hour installed before you have to start messing around with all these benefits and analysis. And if we had a $400 kilowatt hour installed storage device today, we wouldn't really need policy. The market would adopt it. So some of the emerging technologies in the pipeline are really trying to get at lower cost, lower life cycle. Things like lithium air, zinc air, rechargeable zinc air. There's also some interesting flywheel technology that's in the pipeline as well.
Great. And we've discussed the energy storage technologies themselves, but what other technical needs do you see in the systems around energy storage that's going to need to be developed in our areas of opportunity for the innovative minds of Silicon Valley to help develop as energy storage takes off as an industry?
So one area which is promising is the power electronics area, which is the area that Brad's company is involved in. Both from a system design standpoint and particularly from a Silicon Valley standpoint, the opportunity for innovative power semiconductors in addressing the need to move large amounts of power efficiently. There's also tremendous opportunity, as evidenced by the question from the Cisco guy in the audience. Communications and smart grid is an integral part of making maximum use of storage. If you step back and you kind of look at the parallels between the electricity grid and the telecom grid, it used to be the telecom grid was just a giant just-in-time delivery communication service. It was all circuit switched. You call somebody, you talk to them immediately, and the whole industry was built around that. And as the internet grew, it switched to a store and forward network. So that even if you're talking with somebody real time over Skype or VoIP, you're still basically getting your voice packetized and moved forward through a store and forward network. Companies like Cisco have just done tremendously on grabbing hold of that transition and capitalizing on it. With energy storage in the grid, we're doing the same kind of transition. We're going from a giant just-in-time delivery system. When you switch on a light switch, there's a generator somewhere that's actually that moment generating that electricity, to one which is a store and forward system where you have storage strategically located throughout the grid. You're disconnecting the generation of that electricity from the use of it and using the storage to buffer it. And I think if you went back 20 years and said what's going to happen in the telecom industry with store and forward, you'd probably have barely a glimmer of things like YouTube and Google and so forth. Same thing for energy. We're at the start of a whole transition to our energy infrastructure. It's going to affect transportation, it's going to affect housing, buildings, everything else. And I think the room there for innovation is dramatic. This is like the 1960s in the internet when the first internet and email was being deployed and there were just a couple of links on it. We've got a long, long way to go here with tremendous amounts of innovation opportunities.
One model that you may see come out is what's happened similar to the storage industry, where there's a whole bunch of panel folks, and certainly up and down 101 there's several of them, and a group of installers, right? The Akinas of the world that are putting the panels, whether it's on the Costcos of the world or the homes of the world. There are a large number of storage startups, several in the audience here, and then we'll start to see companies like SNC Electric and other companies that will be the installers. So if you are just making the panels, in this case the batteries, and selling them. So it'll be interesting to see how that model emerges and whether it follows solar or not.
Yeah, and beyond that, then we could get the financiers and all the different plays around it. So I think solar is a good industry to look to see how it'll develop.
Market structures is another area which is really interesting. People are generally unaware of the fact of how disconnected the wholesale markets are from the retail markets. The retail markets, if you're an end customer, you just have a flat rate for electricity, or if you're a business customer, at most you might have three different rates: a peak rate, an off-peak, and a shoulder rate, which is kind of in between the two. If you look at the wholesale electricity prices, and they're publicly available on the web, they change every 5 minutes, and they're hugely volatile. They can swing $1,000 a megawatt hour in 5 minutes. They can go from minus $200 a megawatt hour in some areas of the country to $800 a megawatt hour, $900 a megawatt hour in 5 minutes. So the issue of taking the pricing that exists on the wholesale level and moving it to the retail side and letting consumers take advantage of that pricing to help balance out the grid by responding to price signals is another area that I think it fits directly into storage, because storage becomes the mediator that makes that possible. But I think that significantly empowers people to do innovative things with the grid.
Great. And Tom, I was hoping to ask you, as somebody who recently transitioned into an energy storage startup, what advice you have for people in the audience, particularly technologists that want to get involved in clean tech and in energy storage? How did you find such a great company?
So we're here in AMD in Silicon Valley, and one thing that's very interesting to me is to look at what's happened to the dramatic logarithmic growth in the cost of semiconductors over the years. And it's well publicized, and we all know Moore's law, and we walk around with 4 gigs in our pocket that costs us a couple $100. We are nowhere near that in terms of dollar per watt type of thinking or pennies per watt type of thinking. But one thing that was attractive to me, having come from that semiconductor industry, is what can we collectively do to try to figure out how to put energy or storage on that same type of thinking. Now, it's probably not going to be logarithmic because it's material science and it's all sorts of wacky chemistry and stuff that causes problems. But certainly it's attractive to the VCs of the world. Certainly it's absolutely needed. So that's what makes it exciting. A little risky, but it's certainly exciting.
Good. And Dan, we've talked mostly, almost exclusively about grid-based energy storage, but I was hoping you might be able to just draw a few conclusions about how the needs, particularly the technical needs for grid-based energy storage, is different from automotive energy storage, where the innovation can overlap. And you mentioned a little bit with applications for PHEV batteries in community energy storage, for example. But how are the technical needs different, and how will kind of the innovation mirror each other versus diverge?
Sure. So both of them, of course, share the common ability to take materials innovations in batteries that are driving the cost down and take advantage of that, but there are some significant differences. In automotive, the value of fast recharge is probably higher. I mean, you'd ideally like to get to the point where you can pull into a gas station and while you go in and get a coffee, your car recharges. So there's a premium value of that, I think, in the automotive space. Weight and size are obviously critically important. The environmental conditions for automotive are very different because you have to be able to deal with driving down Highway 5 in the middle of the summer, whereas with a stationary application for the grid, you can provide air conditioning and so forth to do more controlled environmental condition. Mechanical vibration is a big issue for automotive. Crash safety is obviously really essential. That's really not an issue with respect to a stationary situation. And the performance specs need to be, in some senses, more predictable for automotive. If you're expecting to have a 200-mile range, you really have to have it because you don't want to get 10 miles from your destination and then run out of electricity. So one of the interesting interplays here will be as batteries start to meet the end of their performance range in cars, they may still be perfectly good, they just can't do the 200 miles anymore, whatever the limit is. You can then repurpose them and move them into the grid. And so that presents some interesting opportunities as we look 5 or 10 years out to take the batteries that have been used in automotive and start to deploy them in grid applications.
Dan, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I totally agree with all those comments David mentioned. I would just add maybe from the utility side, safety, reliability, and long cycle life are really essential. Utilities like to put assets in on the ground and just forget about them and maybe leave them there for 15, 30 years. That's a real challenge for storage. So there needs to be a robust technology. There also needs to be a service infrastructure around supporting those assets. The requirements vary by application. So it's really hard. There's no single storage silver bullet that fits all of them. So sort of the functional requirements really in the tech specs vary by application. Brad mentioned community energy storage. We're actually using the term more distributed storage at the edge of the grid because community kind of implies more of a certain business model. But there, again, if it's near the pad-mounted transformer, it's going to have to be safe, quiet. David mentioned the environmental, the temperature impacts. It's got to be obviously a small footprint. You don't want a tennis court-sized battery in your neighborhood. There are some interesting applications that synergies between transportation and stationary. And as I mentioned, we're really right on top of that. We really think the market, rather than wait 10 or 15 years for secondary battery applications, we think there's a near-term immediate market for using lithium-ion-based PHEV platforms in stationary applications. Not only in some of the applications you see outside where frequency regulation, but we think there could be some utility scale applications for these types of batteries. So that really opens up some really interesting business models. Do the utilities buy the batteries or partner with auto companies who want to drive volume production? One other comment, and then I'll close. A common need in all this is going to be a standard communication protocol. The plug-in vehicles are going to be smart grid compliant. We need to make sure that the stationary batteries or storage systems are also smart grid compliant. So there's a lot of work going on to make sure that, depending on the business model, whether it's a third party or an end user or utility, when this storage device does hook up to the grid, that it will be a recognizable asset. It will have a handshake and be dispatchable.
Great. No, those are really good perspectives, and I think we've covered a lot on the technical side. At this point, I want to open it up. I think we just have a couple minutes for questions, if there are any questions from the audience.
Thanks. Charlie Vartanian from A123. On the technology side, I've got an opinion that NERC, North American Electrical Reliability Council, and here the regional council is the WECC, really are the wizard behind the curtain, whether it's a market in the wholesale. You can trace it back to a NERC criteria, or if it's a T&D investment, they're meeting a NERC criteria. Would like to get the panel's opinion on, let's say, the technology, promoting technology within that forum. What would be the avenue in, and how could a technology leader approach that forum and promote storage to that audience?
Good question.
I have a very show-me attitude as a company looking out. And it's somewhat similar to my answer or my thoughts behind policy. If you can get to the cost that Dan spoke of, if you can have something that, oh my gosh, makes sense and is the iPod of the industry, then it will bring itself to NERC, or it will the policies will take care of themselves. So from a company perspective, that's where hopefully 99% of our energy is focused, and that other stuff will take care of itself.
So I think, thanks for bringing them up, because I think what that highlights is just the multiplicity of agencies that are involved in this decision making, and the need to somehow cut through the agency clutter and have one of them emerge as a leader to drive this. Certainly NERC's role in reliable grid and looking forward and planning what we're going to need and so forth is important, but the thing that's missing for storage across the board is one of the agencies stepping up as a champion and saying, we're going to make this happen, and we're going to lead the charge to implement it. This is part of the reason that we've argued that what's really needed is a mandate for storage, because that tends to cut through the regulatory clutter and basically drive it from a business standpoint. Right now, I think there's too many regulatory agencies involved, and it's dysfunctional because there's not leadership emerging. If NERC can take that leadership role, happy days.
I do want to, one quick follow-up is kind of push back on this, the technology maturity and cost issue. Electrical energy is a $400 billion per year business in the U.S. I believe that 1% of that, $4 billion, is completely accessible today with a variety of technologies at their current cost and can beat the incumbent technology. No doubt about it, and glad to discuss that out front. $4 billion is a big market to chase, and NERC specifically on one. They had defined in the West that spinning reserve must be provided by a generator, and that frequency regulation must come from an asset that qualifies for spinning reserve. Thus, you couldn't do it with a battery. That is a concrete example today of what a critical path gatekeeper NERC is. Now, ISO is working on behalf of the storage community to change that rule, and one general approach, A123's feedback was, don't be prescriptive. Generalize everything to any resource that can meet a current capability. don't worry about my technology. I'll give you a warranty. I'll tell you what the cost is. You decide. But I'm a strong believer. You were talking about a big industry. If we believe that it's so efficient that new technology can at least attack the fringes, well, we got a problem.
I really agree with that, because the industry has grown up around the idea of generation load and wires, and the market rules, the reliability rules, the tariffs are basically all structured around that, and those need to be changed in the way Charlie is suggesting in order to allow them to be technology agnostic, and in some cases they are not today. There are markets you can go after today. Storage is proven on the grid. The technology that's been around the longest for grid scale storage is the sodium sulfur battery out of Japan. They have 200 installations running in Japan, about 300 megawatts. They just closed a 150 megawatt order from EDF in France, 300 megawatt order from Abu Dhabi. There are big orders going down to non-American companies in the international markets, because they recognize that storage is viable today in large deployments. We've got to start fooling around with these small demos and start moving to significant deployment on the grid, or we'll never get the amount of storage in the grid we need to support the renewables. We're going to lock ourselves into an ancient infrastructure of just-in-time delivery. We're going to have a much more flexible grid. If they start deploying the amount of transmission they're talking about to handle the peak load, that's going to undermine the ability to deploy the storage and move to a much more modern, smart grid. The amount of transmission they're talking about is probably impossible to deploy anyway because of the permitting, and if that unfolds, that means basically the renewables are going to have to stop. Or the renewables will be curtailed, which will destroy the economic model the renewables are operating under because they're cut back. So this is really a critical issue. We're at a critical junction now. We've done the studies. Our international partners are doing large deployments. We have to start moving ahead with implementation. There's really no good reason not to. There's just an absent leadership and cutting through at the governmental and regulatory level to make this happen.
Do we have time for another question? One last question. It's tough when you're competing with lunch.
Some of that, of course, is technology specific. We talked a little bit about lithium. Most of that comes from, Chile and Bolivia, I think. So that could be an issue. Depending on your other chemistries at work, right? There's all sorts of stuff out there. There's zinc bromine, zinc chloride, the zinc air. So zinc, I think, is okay. Some of this is domestically available and inexpensive. Vanadium's a little expensive, because there are VRB batteries out there. So some of it depends, but I think lithium is probably getting the most attention currently. And there are startups, Kelsey mentioned one of them, that are looking at different ways of getting lithium, because that also is an opportunity. It's a challenge and opportunity, to use Janice's line.
Okay, well, thank you to Kelsey and our technology panel.
Good job.